First of all, thank you for your indulgence for the circumstances. Then I'm sure we would all prefer better circumstances under which to meet and to discuss these important topics. I just wanted to ask one question before I continue. When we were listening to the presentations there, sometimes the audio would cut out. Is this something that you've experienced on that end too? And if so, was it very disruptive?
No, it wasn't. We heard you very well. So
excellent.
Continue. Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good.
I put us on mute.
Okay, very good. Then I'll begin without further ado, and in fact, I will, because of the circumstances that we're in and the nature of this presentation being remote, I will try to make this presentation a little bit abbreviated, but cover the important points of the report. Of course, you all know that the report is available online, as are all our reports, and we encourage you to look at them. I'm going to try to use this pen, so I hope that you can see the things that I can write with that pen as I highlight different aspects of the report. This is the third report on elections that PFA has done. We've done a mayoral report, the presidential report in 2008, and it's no coincidence that we're putting emphasis on elections, because voting and elections are one of the most elemental and important functions of a democracy. And the people's vote and the civic voice that is expressed through the vote is the primary mechanism for holding accountable and responsible the officials in charge of the trajectory of the company. So naturally, we're all interested in how these elections are conducted, but not only we. The Armenian government itself is also interested in showing the world that it can hold free and fair elections. As a result, it invites observer agencies such as the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the Council of Europe, to come to Armenia and observe the voting process. What I'm going to do is start with a report from the OSCE on this past election from 2012. And I'm not going to go through all this, but I just want to highlight a number of things that they wrote in their executive summary, which generally was positive on the report. They said that positive on the elections. They said the elections were competitive, vibrant, and largely peaceful during the campaign. The electoral code, they thought, was generally solid and could sustain democratic elections. The Central Election Commission of Armenia, responsible for organizing the elections, acted professionally and efficient, according to the OSCE. Of course, they did find some problems. There were problems with the voter registers and the voting lists, which they cited. But no election is perfect, of course. But they did go on to say that candidate registration was inclusive, the campaign was vibrant, the media, interestingly, according to their characterization, overall met their obligation to provide free and paid airtime to ensure non-discriminatory conditions. They did observe misuse of administrative resources, and they thought that the complaint system was unduly restrictive for election-related complaints. But overall, and especially on election day, they characterized the voting process as orderly and well-organized, notwithstanding some negative assessments on some polling stations due to shenanigans that they detected during the voting day. So this report on the parliamentary elections from the OSCE paints an overall positive picture on the reports. And if we compare past OSCE analyses from previous elections in Armenia, we can see that this last parliamentary election kind of stands out in terms of the general quality of conduct. The legal framework has been improving steadily, according to the OSCE, and now is generally solid. The campaigns have gotten a lot better over time. There's the Electoral Commission has improved its functionality. The voter registers still remain a concern, and we're going to talk in detail about that. Media coverage still shows some bias, but overall, compared to previous elections, the 2012 parliamentary elections in Armenia really stand out as something positive. And we wonder what that will mean in terms of the 2013 presidential election and how the OSCE evaluates those. Based on all of this, we have to ask the question, is Armenia learning how to conduct democratic elections? Are we getting the civic vote, the civic voice expressed through voting? Are they really able to suppress fraud and root it out from the election cycle? Because based on the reports of OSCE, we have perhaps reason to be optimistic. Well, I'm sure we all want to be optimistic, but is there a way to be sure, more quantitatively sure about the outcomes of the parliamentary election without resorting to anecdotal and opinions that are more qualitative? For example, generally trusted electoral emissions or a bias towards certain parties were noticed. And a auxiliary question to this is, are we sure that the OSCE monitors are able to catch all the different types of fraud that may be going on during these elections? Is there a way that we can be certain quantitatively that the elections are going well? Well, the answer to that is yes. It turns out that there are a number of statistical tools that have been developed over the past decade or so, forensic fraud detection tools, which have been applied in different countries and for different electoral cycles by political scientists using various statistical techniques in order to detect fraud in the elections. The best part of these statistical analyses is that it uses the data provided by the government's own electoral agencies to look for the fingerprints of fraud in the elections. We at PFA, Policy Forum Armenia, have used these forensic fraud detection techniques on the data provided by the Central Electoral Commission of Armenia in order to test the hypothesis of whether or not these elections, parliamentary elections in 2012, were fair. And I'm going to describe the test to you now. They're statistically based and mathematically founded, but I'm going to try to present it in such a way that you don't really need a mathematical background. All you need is an intuition about what is trying to be measured and how we make our conclusions based on the measurement. All of these tests are based on a hypothesis that what a voter turnout should look like if everything were fairly executed on a level playing field. And we compare that hypothesis to what the data show us, the data given to us by the Central Electoral Commission of the Armenian government. So let's take a look at the first forensic test that we performed. This test uses voter turnout and the number of polling stations during the electoral cycle. There were about 2,000 polling stations in the May 2012 elections in Armenia in operation. And each polling station has a list of registered voters. So at each polling station, we can compute the voter turnout ratio for that polling station. Normally, when we talk about voter turnout ratio, we are referring to the number of people who came out and voted in the entire country. But what we're doing here is we're atomizing a little bit that ratio, and we're boring down to each polling station and looking at the number of voters who voted at each polling station compared to the number of registered voters at those polling stations. if we were to make a graph of the number of polling stations versus the voter turnout ratio at those polling stations, what we expect in a free and fair election is a curve which is known as the normal distribution. Right? This is something that I'm sure some people have seen. Anyone who's taken a test or who has gone to university is familiar with this curve. It's also known as the bell curve. People tend to want to be on this side of the bell curve because it means that they're going to get a good grade. What we're going to do is we're going to compare our expectation of the distribution of the number of polling stations versus voter turnout to this bell curve. And what we should see is something that looks similar to this curve. It should be rather symmetric. It should have smooth features. So let's take a look at the data, keeping in mind what we expect from this distribution. When we take the data from the 2012 elections, and also we include here the 2007 and 2008 elections, we see something that does not look normal, so to speak. We see a distribution that maybe perhaps starts out looking like the normal bell curve, but then as the voter turnout ratio increases, we see effects here that do not remind us of the normal distribution. What we're seeing here in this region, in the 2012 and in the 2007 elections very prominently, and somewhat as well in the 2008 election, is an indication of artificially inflated voter turnout. Our model is showing us that something fishy is going on here. Despite fewer reports of fraudulent activities at the voter stations during counting, this statistical analysis is showing us that fraud did occur and that fraud did exist. We conjecture that during the voting period, there were cases of multiple voting which artificially inflated the voter turnout ratio for a number of polling stations. So, briefly said, our first forensic test shows us that we have reason to be suspicious about the integrity of the vote count. Let's go to the next vote, the next forensic test, which is known as the digit test. Again, we're going to use the vote count at each polling station. At the end of the election, each polling station must report the number of votes, and this is the vote count. And for an example, I've given you a number of vote counts that I've made up just off the top of my head. The digit test for detecting fraud takes the last digit of the vote count from each polling station and separates it from the rest of the number. If the election was conducted fairly and votes were counted in a fair manner, any of the digits that appear in the final tally of the last digits of the vote count should appear roughly 10% of the time. In other words, 10% of all of the last digits of the vote counts should be 2, and 10% should be 9, 10% should be 0. Ideally, each digit will appear 10% of the time in our analysis. If not, then human tampering of the vote count is implied. It turns out that humans have some psychological bias for some digits as the last digit of a number and against other digits as the last digit of the number. Let's take a look at the data, again, from the Central Electoral Commission that we've analyzed based on the digit test. If we take the full sample of vote counts from all of the polling stations, we get this graph. Here we list all the digits, 0 through 9, and this is the percent that we expect each digit to lie at, 10%. What we see is that some digits meet our expectation, while others are quite distorted from the expected value of 10%. What this means is that someone has replaced the natural vote counts with their own numbers. And since a human interfered in this, in the electoral process, to assign a vote count to a particular voting station, we see this distortion in the digit test. Interestingly, if we compare, for example, Yerevan alone, and only the districts in Yerevan, we can see that while we do see some distortions in the vote count, generally things are almost on the 10% mark. But if we go outside of Yerevan, we see a more strong influence, a human influence on the vote count, indicating that outside of Yerevan, we see a higher level of tampering, of creative accounting in the vote count. So this digit test shows, again, from a different perspective, that fraud was present during the parliamentary elections, despite the rather positive observer reports. Now, I've shown you two forensic tests for fraud, and I've shown that both of these tests show that fraud is present in the elections, but we don't know who is benefiting from the fraud. In this third test, we will graphically show who is the direct beneficiary of the fraud during the elections. The third test that we performed compares the political party's share of votes, overall votes, versus turnout. In this axis, we show the share of all votes for a given political party, and on the x-axis, we have the voter turnout. Now, I'm not going to go through and explain the whole analysis, but in a word, if we draw a line through all of these data points, the slope of that line should reflect the overall share of votes that the party received. We know that from the last parliamentary election, the Republican Party received 44% of the votes. Prosperous Armenia Party received roughly 30% of the votes. The Armenian National Congress received 7%, and Heritage also received 6%. So the slope of these lines that we fit to the data in this forensic test should correspond to the party share of votes. If it does not, if the slope is larger than the party share of votes, this would indicate ballot stuffing that is benefiting that particular party or candidate. And what we see here in this analysis is that the slope for the Republican Party's data of party share of votes versus turnout is 0.96. In other words, 96% of every extra 100 votes as we increased voter counts were going to the Republican Party. For the Prosperous Armenia Party, which received 30% of the votes in the parliamentary election, its linear fit for this graph is only 0.15, which means that many of its votes were actually stripped during the election. And it's even a worse situation for the Armenian National Congress and the Heritage Party, which have actually negative slopes for their in their graphs, indicating that all parties were losing votes to the Republican Party. So this forensic test shows us directly who the beneficiary of the fraud has been. Now, I'd like to take just one moment and say, remind us that what Mark Twain once said, that there are three kinds of lies. He said there are lies, damn lies, and then there are statistics. I just want to mention that we know that some statistics can be can lie, can be manipulated, can show what the people who are presenting the analysis want to be shown. But I just want to emphasize here that in our analysis, the data that we are using comes from the government. And the means that we use to analyze the data are used in different countries around the world by different political scientists. So I hope that our statistical analysis doesn't fall in the damn lies category. Now, so the three forensic tests show that there has been fraud in the parliamentary election. Yet, the OSCE reports say that at least on election day, at the ballot box, they observed fewer cases of fraud. How do we reconcile these two observations? Well, we believe that the fingerprints of fraud that we have uncovered in these forensic tests are rooted to a large extent in the voter list. And this is, of course, something that happens, the formation of the voter list is something that happens outside of the voting station and would, of course, escape notice of foreign observers. Why do we think that the voter list is a source of fraud? Well, we have two hypotheses. The first, that the voter list is calculated without factoring in emigration. If the voter list is calculated without factoring in emigration, that means that the voter list is inflated. There are many more possible voters in the election than there are actual voters. And the possible voters who are not actual voters in the election are in the hands of the voting authorities, and they can do anything they want with those votes. And we're going to test this hypothesis to show you that this is pretty much the case. The second hypothesis is that if a reasonable level of emigration is assumed, the level of turnout in this last nationwide elections is implausibly high. So let's take a look at these two hypotheses based on our guess that the voter list is a major source of fraud. Well, in the interest of time, let me just very greatly summarize that if we take demographic data, again, from the government's National Statistical Service, and we do very basic arithmetic calculations, okay, based on who's turning 18, who is passing away in that time period, and we count the number of eligible voters without factoring in immigration, we come up with a number that is pretty much a match to what the Armenian voting authority says as the number of eligible voters in Armenia, which indicates that the Armenian authorities did not factor in immigration when they came up with the voting list. In the second hypothesis, we show that the voter turnout is improbably high if we assume a very reasonable amount of emigration over the years. Here we show both for the presidential and the parliamentary elections the number of official eligible voters and the number of eligible voters if we factor in immigration. And we can see the official count is continually growing. The more realistic, in our view, count factoring in immigration is continually decreasing. If we looked at the voter turnout based on the official statistics, we'd get something a little bit over 50%. But if we factor in immigration, the voter turnout becomes an implausibly high 92%. This is a number that is on par with countries such as Azerbaijan. And in our case, it just indicates that things are not as they seem in terms of the level of turnout. So we're not alone, by the way, in noticing that the voter list is greatly exaggerated. Members of the opposition parties also note that the migration trends over the past 10 years just don't make the numbers add up with the voter list. The summary I'll get to right now is that if we remember from the beginning, reports from observers gave us a kind of a rosy view of the outcome of these elections, but our analyses and our statistical the data that we've received from the Central Electoral Commission of Armenia show that fraud is still a significant factor. But the main mechanism of fraud has changed. It's changed. It's come out of the ballot box, and it's moved into a different arena. It's moved into the area of the voter lists, where we have basically the people who hold the voter lists have in their hands votes with which they can do anything they want, because the voter lists are greatly inflated, about 30% more than actually exist in Armenia. Consistent with the observer accounts, fraud outside of the polling stations had increased to compensate for a reduction in unlawful activities inside the polling stations. What kind of activities? Bribes, giving out tractors, intimidations, etc. These are things that are a little bit harder to catch by the observer and are increasing. The evidence of fraudulent vote counting outside of Zaven shows, however, that having observers around, the presence of foreign observers does help to reduce fraud at the polling stations. And we saw that in our analysis, the main beneficiary of these fraudulent activities was the ruling Republican Party of Armenia. What do we recommend? Well, to the opposition parties and civil society in Armenia, they are working, they know about and are working on the missing voters issue, the inflated voter list issue. One thing that could possibly discourage voter inflation is disclosing the voter lists in polling stations with abnormally high turnout. To the election observers, we recommend more coverage of polling stations, especially outside Yerevan. They also need to have a better understanding of what is going on in Armenia politically and economically, and perhaps they need to adjust the criteria for assessing election conduct in Armenia. And to the diaspora, to us, it always falls to the diaspora to provide funding, but besides that, we can directly participate in election monitoring efforts. On the Kelart.com website, I saw an interesting discussion about this, and perhaps it'll become a reality. So, taking a step back and looking at all of the report as a whole and the situation as a whole, according to Shedler, who's a elections analyst, a political scientist, elections are usually the hallmark of democracy, but they can also become a tool for authoritarian power holders to legitimize their rule. If they can make the election look good, then they look good as well. But this damages the rule of law, and it causes more problems. It exacerbates migration, and it widens social disparities, which all leads to a sliding down a kakistocratic path where the people in power are the least qualified and the most corrupt in society. So how do we break this cycle of electoral bribes and poor governance? Well, one thing is what we're doing today, active participation and perhaps applying some unconventional ideas. With that, I'd like to step back and let you continue, and we'll hang on for if there are any questions later on. Thank you very much.
And David's back. If I could just add one more thought to what Zaven said in conclusion of this, and just to tell you that the policy forum is not just about reports and not just about analytics. I think it's about a choice of what to do. If we all choose to believe that Armenia belongs to only those who live there, and by leaving Armenia and being elsewhere, being outside, we shouldn't be involved, we shouldn't in fact care what's happening in Armenia, that's one way to go. But if you trust that Armenia belongs to all of us, there are a number of ways that one could get involved. And there's certainly our friends and colleagues at Armenian Renaissance people in pre-parliament, guys in Sardarabad, and us at the Policy Forum Armenia have made this choice. Would like you to join us. Would like you to believe that Armenia belongs to us and that by joint effort we can change things on the ground and make it a better place, a better country for all of us to be. Thank you for your attention.